Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this domestic violence bill and join my colleagues in wishing all the women of St. Lucia, the women of the world, the women of the Caribbean, happy International Women's Day, Mr. Speaker, and wish the women in my life Happy International Women's Day, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these my colleagues sing differently. I do have two women in my life. One of them is my daughter. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is to provide for the protection of victims of domestic violence. And Mr. Speaker, I recall sometime Catherine Silis came to my office with, I think, 2 or 3 other ladies and told me that there was need to review the laws as related to domestic violence. And she literally threatened me. I'm not a victim of abuse. Telling me that if, God forbid, and we won elections and I didn't pass the bill, she will be the first one to be on my case. But I'm happy that when we go into government, there were 2 ladies in the cabinet who were equally on my case. So Catherine's threat did not materialize. But Mr. Speaker, the bill it kind of replaces the Domestic Violence Summary Proceedings Act, Mr. Speaker, of 1995. And it seeks to improve on the acts, to provide a more expansive definition of domestic violence. And it doesn't limit it mainly to acts of physical and verbal abuse, Mr. Speaker. It also, in the Act, Mr. Speaker, it does not sufficiently capture the changing nature of domestic violence, which can take the form of sexual abuse, molestation, stalking, and coercion. And the member for Kashmir South made the point that there are different types of abuse, which is not necessarily physical abuse. There's verbal abuse, there's there's intimidation, there's withholding people's freedom. All that is abuse. So the domestic violence bill seeks to put all these things in perspective, Mr. Speaker. So having said so, Mr. Speaker, this bill will repeal the acts and bring it more in terms of modern life, Mr. Speaker. The member spoke about abuse of phone calls, threats, Mr. Speaker, because several times we inadvertently abuse people and we do not realize that we are abusing them. And the police before only had the criminal act to act upon. So in several situations where there was abuse, there was an act of criminality, but the police only used the criminal act, the criminal code, to deal with that abuse. So the domestic violence bill seeks to make these acts an offense which is punishable, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, enacting the bills are fine, but we have to police them and we have to make sure it works. And I think domestic violence stems from the home, Mr. Speaker. Because several times we set examples to our children and we do not even remember or understand that we are setting this example, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can proudly say that my mother and my father I've never seen, and they're dead now. I never saw my dad ever raise his hands on my mother. Never, Mr. Speaker. And when they needed to quarrel, they waited when they thought I was asleep. They waited when they thought I was asleep, and they began to have their discussions. And when they got up in the morning, it was as if nothing happened, Mr. Speaker. And this is why possibly today I'm a pacifist. And people think that they can take advantage on me, and they underestimate me. And they did that so much that they put me where I am today. Mr. Speaker, so this idea of violence is something that we have to stop, Mr. Speaker. We have to stop. We have to stop the abuse. We have to stop the intimidation, Mr. Speaker. And sometimes a lot of it comes through selfishness and arrogance, and the belief that we always have to be right, and we can't admit that we're wrong. We can't admit that we've made a mistake, Mr. Speaker. We can't admit that. So we end up, no one wants to say, I'm sorry, no one wants to say that I'm wrong. But Mr. Speaker, so I'm saying that whereas this bill has all the requirements, it's modern legislation, and as the minister said, it will possibly help me in that I hope she can bring some money into the coffers so we can assist more, Mr. Speaker, because as you know, the fiscal realities are real, Mr. Speaker. Speaking about fiscal realities, I want to compliment the staff of the Ministry of Finance, because only this morning we got the information that St. Lucia is still considered as a country that is not on any so-called blacklist as far as Europeans are concerned. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to compliment all the people, the ladies and the men and the gentlemen who made this bill possible. I want to say that we have to enforce it. We have to make sure it works, Mr. Speaker. We have to make sure that we educate the police in how it works. And because all violence is wrong. And there are certain acts of violence that we have to stem at the bud, Mr. Speaker. The obscene language in public, the abuse of people, the threats in public, Mr. Speaker, the wanting able to run radio stations without licenses, these acts of criminality. And we have to stop these things, Mr. Speaker. It has to be a holistic approach to this entire thing. And finally, I would have hoped that the member for Choiseul would not have brought the politics into this discussion, Mr. Speaker. I would have hoped that he would have forgotten the cut and thrust of politics, and at least for once in this honorable house, come away from it. But he had to open the door, Mr. Speaker. And since he opened the door, it's my duty to defend the government that I have the privilege to lead, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just very, very quickly. Mr. Speaker, do you know that for our 8 months in office, we have been the only government that has not sent, I want to use my words correctly, one public servant home because of the political affiliation. Not even at the level where we can do it, Mr. Speaker. I'm talking at the level of cleaner, of driver, of office assistant. We have kept every one of them, Mr. Speaker. Everyone. Give another example, Mr. Speaker. There's a program called NAPS in Vieux-Fort. Everybody in there is a political appointee. One of the people who work there, every day, she's on Facebook using her name, saying the worst things about me and the worst things about the government. We've kept her there for the last 8 months. And in fact, she boasts on Facebook that they can't do anything, Mr. Speaker. She remains there because we believe that people must earn a living in this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you something further. The last government, Mr. Speaker, there are some traditions that we hold dearly. This government refused to keep any of these traditions, Mr. Speaker. The post of Cabinet Secretary is a sacred post. The Cabinet Secretary is the highest serving civil servant, Mr. Speaker. This government, the last government, forced the Permanent Secretary out. Forced the Cabinet Secretary out of office, Mr. Speaker. And he comes here and he speaks about victimization, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you something further. The ambassadors, we allowed every ambassador to serve their term till the contract ended and they left in dignity. The ambassador to Taiwan, he sent a message. He even had the opportunity to give a farewell address, Mr. Speaker, because we treated him with dignity. There's an ambassador who asked to extend her stay for 4 months because of family concerns. We allowed that to happen, Mr. Speaker. The ambassador, the High Commissioner in England, we allowed him to stay to complete his domestic affairs. The ambassador to New York, Mr. Speaker, we allowed him to stay till the end of his affairs and give him some more time to complete it, Mr. Speaker. So we have treated these people with dignity, Mr. Speaker, with the dignity that they deserve. And I want to thank my cabinet colleagues for agreeing to treat people with dignity and respect. That is what we are about, Mr. Speaker. We are about a government of dignity and respect. So when the mayor for Choiseul wants to follow his leader and speak about these things, Mr. Speaker, I have to defend this government. I have to defend the honor and the integrity of this government, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to end by commending all the people who made this bill possible, the Attorney General's office, Mr. Speaker, the people who work in the Ministry of Gender Affairs, and those who work in the other ministries before, and everyone who made it possible, and the people in civil society who also helped to make it possible. Let us make it work. Let's make St. Lucia a less violent place. Let's make St. Lucia the best place to live and work in the Caribbean. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.